I'm going to show you guys how to use diminished chords. Some of you may already know a few places you can use them, but this is what I've found is the best way to think about them so that you're not only limited to a few choice spots. Personally, when I started using them, I felt like I was always guessing which diminished chord works where, and I didn't really fully understand the theory behind it or anything like that. So whatever your situation is, I think this video will help you be able to apply them pretty much anywhere. The first thing to understand about diminished chords is that they're used as a way to get somewhere. It's very hard to find a situation where you're resolving on a diminished chord. Almost always, they're used to create tension before resolving somewhere else. I'm going to go over a few basics just so we're all on the same page here. So diminished chord is made up of minor thirds. We can't exactly play them in order on the guitar, but I'll show you what I mean. So if I have F diminished here, the notes in this chord are F, B, D, and A flat. Now if I put those in order, F, A flat, B, and D, you'll notice that F is a minor third away from A flat a minor third away from B, B a minor third away from D, and D a minor third away from F. Knowing this, we can actually move this entire chord in minor thirds. So I can take this chord and move every note up a minor third or down a minor third. And if you look at those notes in any one of those chords, it's all the same four notes, just in a different order. So here I have D, A flat, B, F. Same four notes, right? Another thing to note is that because all these chords are the same, you can call it F diminished, you can call it A flat diminished, you can call it B diminished, you can call it D diminished. So all those are exactly the same. All right, so let's get into how to use diminished chords. Most people have a tough time figuring out which diminished chord to use where or why it works in some places and not in others. So to avoid that, here's how I think of them. So a diminished chord is basically just a dominant 7 chord with a flat 9. I'm going to show you what I mean. Let's look at an E7 chord, for example. I'm going to play this one here. If we take that chord and raise the root of the chord, the E, just a half step, that gives us our flat 2, or as it's more commonly called, the flat 9. So now this is an E7 flat 9. Now this chord, you'll notice, is the same exact chord as our F diminished that we looked at earlier. So it's safe to say that E7 flat 9 is the same exact thing as F diminished. And since F is just a half step above E, what we can do is think, okay, if we have a dominant chord, you can go a half step up from the root of that chord, play a diminished chord, and it'll give you a dominant 7 flat 9 chord. The flat 9 is commonly used as a tension note for dominant 7 chords, mainly when that dominant 7 chord is leading somewhere else. So you won't hear it often in like a blues setting, but in many instances like jazz music and neo-soul style playing, you'll hear this quite a bit. So this whole concept works really nicely when that E7 or whatever dominant chord it is being used as the 5 chord or the 5-7 chord. Just real quick, a 5 chord is the chord that's built from the 5th note of the scale. And the way that I'm using it here, it's always going to be a dominant 7 chord. When people refer to the 5-7 chord, that's what they mean. It's a dominant 7 chord. So in this case, if E7 is our 5 chord, then our 1 chord is going to be A. And that A can be any quality chord. It can be A major, A minor, whatever. You can double check this by just counting up an A major scale to find that perfect fifth. So if I did that, A, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1 is A, 2 is B, 3 is C sharp, 4 is D, 5 is E. So 5 chord will be E7. So a 5-1 progression, or in this case E7 to A major, sounds like this. Sort of a classic tension resolution progression. Now if we play that E7 chord as an E7 flat 9 chord or our F diminished chord, it sounds like this. So it gives that progression a little bit more edge, right? And remember that F diminished chord can be moved around in minor thirds. So that means any of these can be used as our 5 chord. That was going to A major 7. Here's what it sounds like going to an A minor 7. So it still has that building tension and then a resolution point when you get to the A chord. So now how we can think of this is if you want to create tension before landing on a chord, one of the best ways you can do that is to throw in a 5 chord before you land. And in this case specifically, we're using a diminished chord as our 5 chord. So you have to think backwards a little bit to figure out which diminished chord makes sense. Let's do an example. If I want to get to E minor 7, I'm trying to find the diminished chord that will lead there nicely, that will create some tension before I resolve to E minor 7. So the first step is to find the 5 of E, right? So if I count out my scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that gives me a B. We talked about earlier how the 5 chord is going to be a dominant 7 chord. So we're going to think B7 to E minor 7. And now if we want to play a diminished chord, all we got to do is go a half step up from the root of our 5 chord. So since it's B7, I'm going to go a half step up to C, play a C diminished chord. And remember, we can move that C diminished chord in minor thirds and find our inversions of that chord. So any of those chords will work to create tension, leading to an E minor 7. So if I move this up a minor third, D sharp diminished, 7, F sharp diminished, A diminished, all the same chord, they all work. Now this can be a lot to think about if you're playing and you want to utilize this. So now that we've gone through this process, we can figure out a different way to see this that's a little bit quicker. So one thing I might notice is that with this E flat or D sharp diminished leading to an E minor 7, those two voicings are very close by, like the voice leading is nice there. So I might take that relationship and be like, okay, what's really going on here? The roots of these chords are just a half step away, right? That D sharp is just a half step away from E. So I can now think of this whole thing in relation to my resolution chord. In this case, my resolution chord is the E minor 7. So I can just think, if I want to create tension before that E minor 7, all I have to do is go a half step down from E and play a diminished chord and then lead into it. So half step down from E gives me D sharp. I can play my diminished chord and then land on an E minor 7. So again, thinking backwards a little bit, but that's a lot quicker than thinking I have to figure out what my 5 chord is, then go a half step up from the 5 chord and figure out that all these chords work, you know. I can also go a whole step up from the root of my resolution chord and play a diminished chord. So I can picture that whole step movement if I want. Right? Because we found that this chord, this F sharp diminished, it's the same thing as the C diminished, the D sharp diminished, and the A diminished. And those chords are all the same thing as just a B7 flat 9. Let's do another quick example. So if I want to go to a B major 7, I'm going to take this new trick that I learned of, I can just go a half step down, play that diminished chord, and then resolve on my B major 7, and it'll give me that 5-1 progression. So I'm just going to go a half step down from B. That's A sharp, play an A sharp diminished, and then land on B major 7. And that gives me that tension resolution that's essentially coming from like a 5-1 progression, as if I were to go F sharp 7 to B major 7. Or 5-1. So now I'm going to list a couple chords right here on the screen. I want you to pause the video and tell me which diminished chords would lead nicely into them using this concept. And then press play and you can check if you're right. Something else to notice is that since we found that our diminished chord is basically just a 5 chord, just as 4 diminished chords can lead to 1 resolution chord, 1 diminished chord can lead to 4 different resolution chords. So that F diminished that we looked at the beginning, this one, that we saw leads nicely to an A chord. It can also lead to a C chord. It can lead to an E flat chord. And it can lead to a G flat chord. That F diminished chord can act as the 5 chord for any one of those chords. And you'll notice that those resolution chords too are also all a minor third apart. So it's pretty cool. I'm going to show you a cool way to visualize this. So if this F diminished chord is the same thing as a dominant chord with a flat 9, that means that one of these notes has to be the flat 9. We saw at the beginning that this note here was the flat 9 of the E7 chord, right? So essentially from this diminished chord, to get to just a straight up E7 chord, you just move down that F a half step, right? And it gives you straight up E7 with no flat 9. And we saw that the E7 was the 5 of A, right? So that's why this works leading to A. So I'm going to try that with the other notes in the chord. One by one, move them down a half step and see if that gives me a different straight up dominant 7 chord. So let's try moving down this note here, the B. So that's going to be B flat now. If we look at these notes, that actually creates a B flat 7 chord. So all these notes, F, B flat, D, and A flat, make up a B flat 7. B flat 7 is the 5 chord of E flat. So that's why that works going to E flat, because essentially, if we bring back up that B flat to a B, that's just making the B flat 7 a B flat 7 flat 9. Let's do these last two remaining notes. So this one here, the D, if we move that down to a D flat, that gives us a D flat 7, which is the 5 chord of G flat. If we move that note back up, that's like a D flat 7 flat 9. Works just the same. The very last one here, A flat, if we move that down a half step to G, that gives us a G7. G7 is the 5 chord of C. So if we move that note back up to A flat, it's like a G7 flat 9. Works just the same again. So now we can actually think of this one voicing as 8 different chords, which is pretty crazy. You can call this F diminished, you can call this A flat diminished, B diminished, D diminished. You can call it E7 flat 9, G7 flat 9, B flat 7 flat 9, and D flat 7 flat 9. So that's 8 different ways you can think about this one diminished chord. And therefore, at least 8 different offshoots you can go from this one diminished chord. So in a writing situation, if you want to change keys or get to a different chord that's maybe outside of your key center or anything like that, diminished chords are great because they can pivot to any one of those other chords. There's one more place for diminished chords that I think is really nice. It's a little bit hard to explain theoretically, but the best way I think I can explain it is that it's sort of like a fake out of this idea. So I'll just show you an example and try to explain it. Let's say we're playing C major. And to create a little bit of movement around that C major, we can play a C diminished as well. So it's sort of like a fake out because when you get to the C diminished, you expect it to go elsewhere, maybe like a G chord or something. But it's going back to C. So here's another situation where it's used. So let's say we're still in C. Sometimes if people go to the 4 chord, F, to lead back to C, instead of making that F a diminished chord, or using any of our other diminished 5 chords, what they'll do is go F, F sharp diminished, and then back to C. And oftentimes that C is being played over a G in the bass. The best way I can think of to think of this is that this diminished chord, this could work as a 5 chord going to a G chord, for example. I just landed on G7. But what you'll see here is the voice leading of those root notes. Because that's still happening going back to C, even though this is not a G chord, it still gives us a similar effect of that tension resolution point, almost like a 5-1, even though it's not really a 5-1. So that, in my opinion, is the best way to think about diminished chords. And again, I'm not saying these two are the only ways you can use them, but they probably cover 99% of the ways that diminished chords are used. You can also use this whole way of thinking in your improvising, when you're improvising single lines as well, to figure out which diminished scale or diminished arpeggio to use in a certain place. So I hope this helped. Please like, comment, subscribe. If you have any questions, leave it in the comments. Thanks for watching.